Hi again, I'm Ronald Klaus here for session 3 in our series, Things That Shape Us Without Our Permission. I hope that after the last talk you had a good discussion on paganism and its manipulation, lack of ethics, and the beginning of religious experience. In this and the next talk, we're going to move on to the second of the 4 major cultural periods in the development of Western civilization. Surprisingly, it arose in the Middle East. From there, it migrated to Europe and then to the Western Hemisphere. During the second millennium BCE, there were constant conflicts between the Near Eastern powers. Egypt was dominant in the south. One by one, various Mesopotamian states became dominant in the north. Between them was the very narrow, fertile strip on the western shore of the Mediterranean Sea called Canaan. It became the place of constant conflict between the larger states as they sought to expand their rule into it. This resulted in a lot of destruction, in which even the larger states began to realize was counterproductive. What was the point of fighting over Canaanite areas when the wars wound up decimating its population, destroying its infrastructure, and leaving it desolate and unproductive? So a new idea arose, which we'll call covenant, although it has a somewhat different meaning than what we now mean by that word. Here's how it worked. As one of the powerful emperor's armies approached a small, cowering city-state, he sent them a pronouncement. He told them that he was going to make covenant with them. They would have to submit to him, pay tribute, something like a tax. They would have to accept a legal system that he would impose, but in return they would get his protection, and he would allow them to keep up their own customs and much of their existing political structure, though under him. Technically, the city-state could have refused, but that would have been very foolish. From the point of view of the city-state, this was probably a better deal than combat, since they were genuinely outnumbered and their chances of survival in a military conflict were small. The subservient city-state would have to pledge loyalty and a willingness to be faithful in keeping their commitments, but the emperor had to promise that as well. This was a deal that benefited both sides. It avoided a bloody conflict. The city-state lost its independence, would have to pay tribute, but it gained security and could keep a lot of its present lifestyles. The two partners sealed it with a covenant-making ceremony and also with a covenant meal. Part of the ceremony was a solemn pledge on both sides to the covenant, along with the pronouncement of a dire curse on either party who broke it. Okay, the second development that I said would prove to be a seed to a new civilization took place when a pagan Babylonian emperor introduced the idea of the rule of law. His name was Hammurabi and reigned over an extensive and powerful empire from about 1792 to 1750 BCE. He is best known for his extensive law code, which he compiled during the last 5 years of his reign. It is the first long, well-organized, and best-preserved legal text from the ancient Near East. Here's a picture of the actual so-called stele on which it was written. It's 7 feet, 4.5 inches tall. It depicts Hammurabi, one of his gods Shamash, at the top. Then there are about 4,130 lines of cuneiform text, which was his written language, containing a prologue, the laws, and an epilogue. They're generally in the form of, if you do X, your punishment will be Y. In addition, the law code prescribed the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Again, something new in the ancient world. It probably devised this to inform his legal system on how to judge cases all over his empire. This was not quite a system of ethics yet. Ethics consist of heartfelt values that influence our behavior. This was still just about behavior. But it was a big step beyond the arbitrary rule of all-powerful despots, which had been the way of life of the world until then. It freed citizens from arbitrary sentences for ill-defined crimes. It gave them proper expectations of a justice. And now 2 stories based on how the ideas of covenant and law began to move the Near East and eventually the West toward a new civilization. The first begins with a rich sheik living in a significant city called at that time at or near the tip of the northern tip of the Persian Gulf. He commanded a kind of extended household that later grew to 318 men, ready for war, to say nothing about their wives and children. He was essentially a clan leader. He was also a moon worshipper. But perhaps one of his attempts to align himself with his god, he was startled and felt that something beyond his imagination was happening. He felt that the chief god among all the others was appearing and speaking to him. In this encounter, he felt directed to leave and go to a land that this chief god would show him. He was promised that this god would bless him and use his descendants to bring blessings to the whole world, an amazing destiny. But the most significant thing about this story is that what he was hearing was covenant-making language. A good modern translation of this counter reads something like this. He submitted himself to a covenant with El, the chief of the gods, and because of that came into right standing with El under that covenant. In other words, the deal was sealed. To further reinforce this, in a later trance, he experienced something like a covenant-making ceremony. But here's the big deal about this. Something like this had apparently never happened before, at least not in the Near East. This was not just a covenant with a powerful earthly king, it was a covenant with the most powerful deity then known. This took the idea of covenant to a new level. It meant on one side a promise of great protection and prosperity available to humans. On the other, it meant that God would see everything his covenant people would do. You could not cheat on him. So the sheikh and his clan left Ur, headed north along the Euphrates River, finally west toward the Mediterranean Sea, and then south into Canaan. Okay, before I move on, some of you have realized that I've told you a story from the Bible, although enhanced with some cultural background that we have learned from archaeological and linguistic research. The sheikh I've been talking about is named in the Bible and called Abraham. So it's time for a few words about the Bible. Nowadays, there's great division about the Bible and its stories, everything from extreme skepticism and even hostility on one side to a kind of uncritical acceptance among people who say they're following it. So here are a few observations that give us, whether we're religious or not, some ways to think about it. First of all, its allusions to cultural and political backgrounds of its stories exactly match what archaeology and linguistics have found. Second, wherever there is an allusion to a common event or people mentioned in both the Bible and in archaeological findings, they match. Third, even though the Bible contains 66 distinct writings, authored by over 40 different authors, many of whom did not know each other, or even the other writings that were written, and they were written over more than 1,500 years, there are no fundamental contradictions or inconsistencies. Although I think these things are remarkable, they don't prove that the Bible stories are historical. Many of them, even if true, would not have left archaeological verifications. But in my view, it means that the stories seem credible. That is, they could have happened, and if so, they explain a lot. But even if they're completely false and fabricated, they are the stories that shape this new emerging culture called the Judeo-Christian civilization. And now that I've said it out loud, even that common designation may be offensive to some people. They may wish that this second major culture would not be designated by the two religions that shaped it. But the designation has stuck because scholars, religious or not, have recognized the extent to which these two religions and their holy books have shaped this newly emerging culture. True or not, they are the foundational shaping stories of this second Western cultural period. Whether we realize it or not, this holy book has had its influence on every one of us who is either giving or listening to this talk. Okay, with that, let's jump into the second story, a few hundred years past Abraham. Abraham, his son, and his grandson and their clans eventually settled in Canaan. But because of a severe drought, they were forced to head south into Egypt to find food. They eventually settled in the Nile Delta, which was very fertile land. But over some 400 years, when they started to multiply, they became a threat to the Egyptian ruling class. So the whole Hebrew tribe was enslaved and sorely oppressed. But finally, the story jumps forward to a Hebrew man named Moses, descended from Abraham. Through some fluke events, as a baby he was adopted by an Egyptian princess. She hired his birth mother to nurse and raise him. And from his mom, he learned the long history of his people and came to understand their covenant with the chief god. But because of his time in the Egyptian court, he also acquired an Egyptian education at its best. Along the way, he also learned how to align himself with Abraham's God and also learned to hear him. Feeling commissioned by Abraham's God, he began a series of confrontations with the Egyptian pharaoh, seeking freedom for his people. It was a big and long confrontation, complete with Moses calling down a series of natural disasters so that finally the Egyptian pharaoh agreed to let the enslaved Hebrews go. But the story is far from over. Now that you're out of Egypt, how do you make a nation out of a people who had a 400-year history of slavery? They were likely illiterate, had lived lives of simple daily concerns, with no ethics, no work habits except to be driven by their taskmasters, no knowledge of disease, sickness, or anything else that one needs to know to conduct ordinary life. Nation building would be a formidable task. Moses' ultimate goal was to bring these former slaves back to their ancestral home in Canaan. But for the time being, in 1446 BCE, he led the large Hebrew crowd southeast into the Sinai Peninsula. He seized on the two ideas that we have been discussing, covenant making and the rule of law, to devise a brand new, world-changing strategy for nation building. He persuaded his people that Abraham's and his own God was calling them to come into covenant with him, much like their ancestor Abraham did. The proof was their deliverance from Egypt. The covenant-making God was behind that. At Sinai, Moses took his recently freed people through a covenant-making ceremony to bring them into that covenant with the chief God. Moses put together an ingenious law code, much of whose style is borrowed from that of Hammurabi. But he added two novel things. First were the two great principles behind his law. First, love God with all your heart. Second, treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated if the tables were turned. Second, on the next level were 5 outworkings of these two principles, which today are often called the 10 Commandments. This was the beginning of ethics and morality in the ancient Mideastern world. These ideas still influence us today, whether we are religious or not. Why are we concerned about racism or inequality of opportunity between the sexes or the races? These concerns all come originally from Moses and the Great Commandments. But do we need a divine being in the picture? Many people nowadays don't think we do. But if you're in covenant with a powerful deity, you expect that he would hold you accountable for your goodness and badness. You have to admit that if you believe this, you have a strong incentive to keep his laws and behave well. Why have the despots of the world carried out their horrible inhumanities? It is because they don't believe anyone was watching. But Moses' law went well beyond these general principles. Here are the topics covered in Moses' law in considerable detail to give you an idea of how comprehensive it was. They included worship, politics, justice, economics, social law, agriculture, health, inheritance, women's rights, and education. In addition, Moses set up a system of education and accountability and financed the whole thing with a 10% tax on people's income. Even though imperfectly kept, this eventually resulted in great prosperity. The Hebrews eventually inherited their promised land. Its capital was in Jerusalem. Here's how the Bible describes its prosperity. The king, meaning either David or Solomon, made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Now that may be a bit poetic, but certainly speaks of a time of plenty. That is especially remarkable because the Hebrews never became a large community as either the Egyptians in the south or the Mesopotamians in the north. Yet the Hebrew kingdom became so prosperous that 153,600 men, not counting women and children, migrated into Solomon's kingdom to enjoy that prosperity. This new system, a covenant with the deity, blessings and justice, the rule of law, no one, not even kings, beyond the rule of law, laws that promoted justice and prosperity, a system that promoted education and religious observance, all these things proved to be a great success. It was a system that not only looked good on paper, but for a time actually delivered a society that was the envy of the Near East. But I'm sorry to say that it had a sad ending. The nation split into two right after Solomon's death. Though there were several revivals and returns to prosperity in the period that followed, the overall trajectory of the two kingdoms was downhill until both nations were defeated and deported by successive Mesopotamian kingdoms. The people of Judah, now called Jews, were later permitted to return, but mostly under foreign rule and without the ability to recreate their society of old. The northern kingdom of Israel was absorbed into the cultures of Mesopotamia. So what went wrong? Here's the outward stuff. Because Moses' system depended a great deal on voluntary compliance, it was easy to neglect and violate his laws. It did not prevent the concentration of power at the top, which sometimes allowed kings to oppress and even enslave some of their people, even though such oppression was illegal. The moral requirements were serious, and people often did not want to adhere to them, even though they were for their collective good. The temptation of the orgies and fertility gods were always present. But there's even a more central reason for the failure. Even though Hebrew religion emphasized the need for development of an inner, that is a heartfelt, spiritual, and moral life, most of the Hebrews were not yet at the stage where they had reached that experience. As good as it was, the Mosaic system required actions from people whose hearts had not been sufficiently transformed to the point where their actions flowed from a deeply embedded inner spirituality and morality. So the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, which are the Christian Old Testament, conclude on a sad note, although their prophets gave them hope for a restored kingdom in the future. I will talk about that hope in the next talk that will take us into the more modern version of the Judeo-Christian culture that began to unfold in the Near East in 313 CE. From there it spread to Europe and the Western Hemisphere and continued into the 18th century when it began to be undercut. But here's a question to get your discussion started. Many of the Hebrews were unable to embed their moral law deeply enough into their hearts. How deeply is your own morality embedded in your heart? Is there a consistency between your intentions and your actions? Good to be with you. See you next time.